All right, y'all. Welcome back to another Monopoly skills video. We're doing skills and drills today, and now we're looking at how to find consumer and producer surplus on a Monopoly graph. So let's get started. You should have already downloaded or copied over whatever system you're using these notes, which you can locate on the teams. But now we're looking at 4.2 Monopoly finding producer and consumer surplus. Now, let's throw it back to a second, all the way back to Unit 2, when we first started talking about producer and consumer surplus, right? This Monopoly graph, or excuse me, not Monopoly graph, this perfect competition graph should be really, really familiar to us, right? Where we have a price above the price between demand in here. Well, that's our consumer surplus. That represents the additional value that each consumer gets, right? Let's say this is me. I'm right here, and I'm willing to spend, let's say, $30 for a roll of toilet paper. But I don't spend $30, luckily. I spend whatever PE is, right? And so whatever PE is, that's what I get. And so that extra value that I'm receiving, that's consumer surplus. And when we find this whole area of that triangle, that's when we find total consumer surplus, right? Now, the purple represents producer surplus. That's the same idea, right? Producers, when they sell that roll of toilet paper, right? Roll of toilet paper, maybe it's costing 5 cents to actually make, but in these trying times, they're selling it for $15 a roll or something crazy like that, right? And so that represents the additional value that they get on top of that. If we find the area of that triangle, right, then we have our producer surplus, right? And you might remember in perfect competition, when we're at that equilibrium point, we don't have any deadweight loss whatsoever. Well, let's take that same graph and let's look at a monopoly. Here's our monopoly graph, right? Now, remember, we have a supply line. That supply line is equal to our marginal cost, right? Which is why I drew it as a straight line instead of the Nike swoosh. And then we have a demand line, right? And so the normal equilibrium would be right there. But it's not, because the monopoly follows the profit maximizing rule. The monopoly produces where the marginal cost and marginal revenue intersect. That way that makes them the most profit, right? Well, if that's a quantity of, should be QM, you can change that in your notes, right? And PM, well, you'll notice, what do we have? We have deadweight loss right there, right? Society desires whatever quantity that is and whatever price that is. But they're not getting that, right? They're getting the price that's set by the monopoly, right? So let me erase that really quick. So because the price is all the way up there at PM, well, consumer surplus, it's still the area that's above price and below demand. So it's that area right there. And the producer surplus, you'll notice, is way, way bigger, right? The producer surplus is that entire purple area, right? They're willing to sell it for that much, but they actually charge the much higher price, right? Which is why their total surplus is bigger than before, at least for producers. So let's look at how to solve some of these questions, right? Here's a little practice problem. What should we start with? The consumer surplus? Okay, sounds good to me. Well, what do I have to do? First, I have to find that profit maximizing rule where MC and MR intersect. I find my quantity, and most importantly, I got to bump that line up all the way up to demand to find the price. So the monopoly is charging a price of $12, and they're selling 8 things, right? So that means that my consumer surplus is the area of that triangle. Well, how do I find an area of a triangle? That's base times height divided by 2. So if I go from 12 to 15, that's 3. And when I go from 0 to 8, that's 8. 3 times 8, quick math, 24. Divided by 2, that's $12. of consumer surplus. That's my consumer surplus. Well, what about deadweight loss, right? How can we find the deadweight loss in a monopoly? We know where the quantity ends. We know that the monopoly is only going to make 8 things. We also know that society desires this point where the supply and the demand intersect. And so society really desires 12 things, not 8. And so we can shade in that area, and that area is going to become our deadweight loss. Okay? And so, voice just cracked. Let's give this a number. Let's say that this is 5. From $5 to $12 is a distance of 7, and from 8 to 12 is a distance of 4. 7 times 4. Oh my goodness, I'm giving myself difficult math today. That's 28. And then we divide by 2 because it's a triangle, and that gives us a deadweight loss of $14. Okay? What does this all mean? Well, the monopoly does not function as well as perfect competition, right? There's deadweight loss, and there's not a lot of value for consumers. Monopolies are bad for consumers. They charge a higher price, and they offer a smaller quantity, right? And as consumers, we want lower prices and higher quantities. And so, well, what can we do about it, right? What can the government do about a business? There's a couple things, right? They can regulate, and the way that they regulate in microeconomics is there's 2 main ways. First, you can do a tax. We talked about excise taxes before. Or we can use price controls, right? Now, the issue with a monopoly, I don't know if you all remember this, but when we tax a business, it shifts our supply line up. And what happens to our price? Our price goes up and our quantity goes down. Isn't that the problem with the monopoly? The problem with the monopoly is that prices are too high and the quantity is too low. And so can we just tax a monopoly into doing what we want it to do? No, we can't, right? Because it's going to result in higher prices and a lower quantity. Like I said, that's already the problem, right? And so what is left over for a government to do? Well, the government can use price controls, right? And so how do they regulate these monopolies? They use price ceilings to lower the price, right? And if they lower the price, more people buy it, and so they can buy that thing and get that socially optimal quantity, right? So then the government has a choice, right? They have 2 choices. They can force the monopoly to produce the socially optimal point, but sometimes that socially optimal point will result in loss for that business. I can't imagine a lot of businesses staying in business if they're making a loss every single day, right? That would be like me working for negative money. It's not going to happen, right? I love my job, but you got to pay me to do it, right? And so we have 2 choices, right? We can set our price ceiling at the socially optimal point, which would make it a normal supply and demand graph. Or, if you remember, it would be allocatively efficient. Or we can set it at something called the fair returns price, which I'll show you in a second, which I like to call the break-even point, right? So if we're looking at this monopoly graph, there's a couple things that I want you to notice. First, right there is the profit maximizing rule. We're going to call this the unregulated point. We call it the unregulated point because that's what the monopoly is going to do if the government doesn't put any rules on it, right? If they're not regulated, they're going to try to make as much money as possible, and so they're going to produce where the marginal cost and marginal revenue intersect. Now, the second choice that the government has is the socially optimal point. I know that this is kind of hard to see, but let's imagine that this MC just keeps going up in that Nike swoosh shape. Right? Now, if the government produces at that socially optimal point, well, we have a problem, right? Check this out. That would be the quantity. That would be the price. But the issue is that the average total cost would be above the price. So what does that mean? If the average total cost is above the price, that means that the monopoly would be making a loss, right? So that situation is the situation that I alluded to earlier, where you can't force a business to work for negative money, right? And so what the government can do is the government could subsidize the amount of the loss. So let's say that the amount of the loss here is $100,000. Well, the government could give $100,000 to the business so that they would stay at normal profit, or the government could do something else. Instead of getting the full socially optimal point, the government can kind of compromise here at the fair returns point, also known as the break-even point. We call this the break-even point because at that point, where the demand and the average total cost intersect, that is the point where economic profit is zero, right? And what we said before, well, when economic profit's zero, we call that normal profit, right? The economist is considering opportunity cost in their cost calculations. And so if you can force a business to make a little bit more, but still break even, still make normal profit, well, you know what? That's good for the business. That's good for the people because they get a lower, the consumers, they get a lower price, they get a larger quantity. They don't get the full socially optimal point, right? But the price is lower, the quantity's higher, and the government doesn't have to subsidize the loss from the monopoly, right? Would that still result in deadweight loss? It would. It would result in a little bit of deadweight loss right there, right? So obviously not perfect competition, but still a lot better than the situation we had before where the consumer surplus was so small and the producer surplus was so big, right? So what do you need to remember, right? You need to remember three things. You got to remember these 3 points, okay? You need the unregulated point, which is just your profit maximizing rule. You need the fair returns point, which is where the ATC and demand intersect. And then you need the socially optimal point, which is just your equilibrium point where the supply, marginal cost, and demand intersect, right? Once you have those 3 points, you can pretty much answer all these questions about surplus, and I'll do one with you now. Let's look at graph 1 on your practice, okay? Question 1 says, calculate the area of consumer surplus when the monopoly is unregulated. Unregulated, what's the unregulated point? Oh, that's where the monopoly is making the most profit, where the MR and the MC intersect right there. And so now I need to find consumer surplus. I forgot to give y'all quantities. Good thing this is the practice problem. Let's say 3 and 4. Make my life easier with this math. So now I got to find the area of this triangle. When I go from 6 to 9, that's a distance of 3. When I go to 0 to 3, that's a distance of 3. 3 times 3, that's the type of multiplication I can do. That's 9. It's a triangle, so we divide by 2. And so the area of consumer surplus is $4.50, right? Now it says calculate the area of deadweight loss when the monopoly is unregulated. Well, if the monopoly is unregulated, I can find my deadweight loss by finding where supply and demand intersect. So I know that triangle is my deadweight loss. this distance here is from 3 to 4. That's a distance of 1. And then 4 to 6, that's a distance of 2. 1 times 2, that's $2. Divided by 2, because it is a triangle, that's a deadweight loss of $1. Right? And so now the question says, identify the amount of consumer surplus when the monopoly is set at the socially optimal point. So we set a price ceiling. I'll change my color around to this nice orange color. If I force the monopoly using a price ceiling to produce at $5, well, what does that mean? It means people are going to buy a quantity of 4, right? That's where my supply and my demand intersect. So that is the socially optimal point. And now the consumer surplus used to be small, but now it is this full triangle. And that deadweight loss that was there is now gone, right? So if I want to find the distance of this, when I go from 5 to 9, that's a distance of 4. When I go from 0 to 4, that's a distance of 4. 4 times 4 is 16. Divided by 2 is $8. So the amount of consumer surplus when we set this monopoly up at the socially optimal point would be $8. Okay? Let me know in the teams if you have any more questions. Reach out to your teachers. Reach out to me if you need any help with graphs 2 and 3. And I'll see you on the teams page.